everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into the Mexican-American War. And,
Yeah.
this is one of those events or periods, I guess you could say, that's always kind of fascinated me.
Yeah, and we've
I-
we've got some really interesting sources for this one that I think are really going to challenge some assumptions.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of, I think, our goal with all these deep dives is to kind of go beyond, the textbook version of history
Yeah.
and really kind of like you were saying, challenge these assumptions and see things from different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And this period in particular, I think it really shatters a lot of the preconceived notions that people might have about, the U.S. and its
Yeah,
history.
for sure. So we're talking like 1844-ish.
Yeah,
The
1845.
nation's on the verge of tearing itself apart. Like,
A nation divided.
yeah, exactly. And you've got Texas, right?
Yeah.
This newly independent republic, uh, fiercely pro-slavery, just kind of sitting there like a powder keg, and everyone's trying to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, you've got these
Yeah.
these towering figures, right? Andrew Jackson, he's all about annexing Texas. He sees it as, expanding slavery, solidifying America's power.
Right.
But then you've got his successor, Martin Van Buren, completely opposed. He thinks it'll rip the country apart. And
Talk about a political showdown.
oh, yeah.
And then on top of all that, you've got
Mhm.
this wave of anti-immigrant sentiment starting to bubble up, and a lot of it directed at Irish Catholics.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to see how these fears, these prejudices, they keep popping up throughout history, don't they?
Absolutely. And a lot of it you can trace back to this guy, Louis Charles Levin. He was the brains behind the Know Nothing Party, and he really knew how to exploit people's fears. This idea of outsiders coming in, taking jobs, threatening their way of life.
It's a tale as old as time.
Yeah, sadly. Yeah.
And so you've got all this tension, all this uncertainty, and then into this powder keg steps James K. Polk. And it's so interesting because he's this kind of unlikely figure, mentored by Andrew Jackson of all people, but also really intensely private.
Yeah.
Very different from someone like Jackson.
Yeah, he was a bit of an enigma, really driven, but also very calculated. And I think you have to give a lot of credit to his wife, Sarah Childress Polk.
Oh, absolutely.
She was a brilliant political strategist in her own right, understood the importance of public image, shaping the narrative.
Yeah, you can almost picture them, can't you? Like strategizing behind closed doors, knowing that to get what they want, and what they want is to annex Texas. They need to make it palatable to the public.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because they realize they can't just come out and say, we're annexing Texas. It's too controversial.
Right.
So instead they start using this phrase, re-annexation.
Re-annexation.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Like, it's always been ours. We're just taking back what's rightfully ours.
Even though it wasn't really theirs, right?
Well, there's that. Yeah, they kind of conveniently glossed over the Adams-Onis Treaty, which had settled the border issue decades earlier.
But hey, who needs treaties when you've got manifest destiny on your side, right?
Yeah, manifest destiny. Now, there's a phrase for the ages.
Tell me about it. So this is where John O'Sullivan comes in.
Okay, so John O'Sullivan, he's a journalist, a big supporter of Polk, and he comes up with this phrase, manifest destiny.
And it takes off.
Oh, yeah, it captures the imagination of the nation. It's this idea that America is destined by God to expand its dominion from sea to shining sea.
It's incredible how a single phrase can be so powerful, so seductive,
Right.
and also so dangerous. As we'll see, it's like this perfect storm brewing, right?
Yeah.
You've got this idea of manifest destiny spreading like wildfire, and you've got Polk expertly playing the political game, but he's also a pragmatist.
Oh, absolutely.
He knows he can't just march into Mexico guns blazing.
Hmm.
He needs a justification, something to sway public opinion, to show that he's tried the peaceful route.
Exactly, and that's where his diplomatic maneuvering comes in. It's actually quite a fascinating, if cynical, bit of political maneuvering.
So what does he do?
Well, he sends these two diplomats, John Slidell and William Parrott, down to Mexico with an offer to buy California.
Right.
Now, on the surface, it seems like a pretty sweet deal, right? A big chunk of change for a territory they're not really using.
Right.
But here's the thing. Polk knows Mexico will never accept. They're still fuming over Texas. They see the U.S. as this aggressive bully, and they're ready to fight to defend what's theirs.
So it's all a big setup.
Pretty much. He's setting the stage for conflict, making it look like he tried the diplomatic route when all along he's planning for war.
And it works.
Like a charm, Mexico refuses the offer just as Polk predicted, and bam, he's got his excuse. He goes to Congress, declares that negotiations have failed, that Mexico is the aggressor,
And American blood has been spilled on American soil.
you know the line.
Oh, I know the line.
Classic political rhetoric designed to stir up outrage, and it works. Congress declares war, and just like that, the nation is swept up in war fever.
It's scary how easily people can be manipulated, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a reminder that history is often written by the victors and that things are rarely as black and white as they seem.
And meanwhile, you've got Zachary Taylor, a seasoned general stationed right there on the border, practically begging for a fight.
Oh, Polk knew exactly what he was doing, putting Taylor in that position. It was a calculated risk that paid off. And the thing is, even back then, there were people who saw right through it.
Really? Like who?
Well, there's Ethan Allen Hitchcock. He was a general under Taylor, and he kept a diary where he wrote about his doubts about the war. He thought the U.S. was in the wrong, that they were the aggressors.
A voice of reason in all the chaos.
Exactly. And then you've got Ulysses S. Grant, a young officer at the time. He's writing these heart-wrenching letters to his future wife, Julia, about his experiences in the war.
What does he say?
He's really wrestling with his conscience, you know? He sees the horrors of war firsthand, the violence inflicted on Mexican civilians, and he feels ashamed of his country's actions.
It's a good reminder that even in the midst of these grand historical events, there are real people caught in the middle with real lives and real feelings.
Absolutely. And it's not just the soldiers who are struggling. Back home in the U.S., you've got people speaking out against the war, folks like Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln. What did he have to say about all this?
Well, at the time, he was a young congressman, and he was vehemently opposed to the war. He actually gave this really powerful speech accusing Polk of lying to Congress and the American people of starting an unjust war.
Wow, that's brave.
Yeah, it was a really risky move politically. He was branded a traitor by a lot of people, but he stuck to his principles. He truly believed that the war was wrong, and he wasn't afraid to say so.
You know, it really makes you think about the responsibility we all have to question the narratives we're given, especially in times of conflict.
Absolutely. We can't just blindly follow along. We have to be willing to think critically, to seek out different perspectives, to challenge the status quo.
It's one thing to disagree with the war on principle, but to actually speak out against it publicly like Lincoln did, that takes guts.
Oh, absolutely. He was risking his entire political career, but he knew he had to do what he thought was right.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history is full of these unsung heroes, people who stood up for what they believed in, even when it was dangerous.
And speaking of unsung heroes, I think it's really important to talk about the experiences of Mexican civilians during the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, we've talked about the political maneuvering, the battles, but what about the people caught in the crossfire?
Exactly. The Mexican-American War was incredibly brutal, especially for civilians. And, there were massacres, rapes, looting. I mean, it's tough to read about.
It really is. And it's something that's often glossed over in the history books.
Right. We tend to focus on the big picture stuff, the battles, the treaties. But the real cost of war is measured in human lives and the suffering of innocent people.
And so by 1848, the war is officially over. The United States emerges victorious, and Mexico is forced to cede a huge chunk of its territory.
Yeah, nearly half of their land, including California, gone for a pittance.
It's mind-boggling.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it officially ended hostilities, but it left a lot of unresolved issues, a lot of resentment that lingered for generations.
And then to make matters worse, gold is discovered in California.
Oh, yeah. Talk about adding insult to injury.
It's like this land that Mexico was forced to give up becomes a symbol of American opportunity and ambition.
It's a classic example of how history is often written by the victors, how one group's triumph can be another group's tragedy.
And it's not just Mexico and the United States, right? We also have to talk about the impact on indigenous communities in California.
Absolutely. They were caught in the middle of all this, their lands, their way of life, threatened by this wave of migration and expansion.
It's easy to get swept up in the excitement of the gold rush.
Oh,
But we can't forget about the human cost.
right. And that's something we have to keep in mind as we study history, that it's not just a collection of dates and battles, but a story about real people with real lives and real emotions.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've done a pretty good job of digging into this often overlooked chapter of American history.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's always more to learn, right?
Always. So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep challenging the narratives you've been taught.
Because history is never really over. It's a conversation that continues to this day, and it's up to all of us to keep that conversation going.
Thanks for joining us.